Israel has gone to the polls for the fourth time in 2 years. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu faces a tough re-election battle. While the incumbent Prime Minister remains ahead in the polls, the Likud party is uncertain of clinching a governing majority. Israelis have started to vote, with the nation still divided over whether Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will remain in power or not. Former Defense Minister and religious nationalist Naftali Bennett arrived with his wife at a polling station to cast their votes. 6.5 million registered voters will be deciding the fate of the nation. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also cast his vote as the country holds its fourth election in 2 years. Now, let's tell you about the main contenders for the March 23rd election. Israel's longest-running Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is, of course, the main contender. Blue and white centrist alliance leader Benny Gantz, Likud defector Gideon Saar, who broke with Netanyahu to form his own New Hope party, and Yesh Atid leader Yair Lapid. Netanyahu has turned Israel's world-leading rollout of vaccines into a showcase of his campaign and leadership, while the Likud leader was banking on it to be enough to help him sail through in the polls. Just a day before the elections, Netanyahu was even seen rallying his supporters as he visited a famous market in Jerusalem.
I'm happy to be here with you. I ask you, do you want another election? Do you want a Likud government?
But as the crucial polls inch closer, thousands of people took to the streets to protest against Netanyahu's policies and his leadership. An anti-corruption trial and former allies joining rival parties also means that Bibi's long run could be in danger. While the series of elections have been ongoing since April 2019, in fact, the winning parties have failed to form a stable government in Israel. Experts say that Netanyahu's Likud party is likely to emerge as the biggest player, but polls indicate that Israel's election is heading towards a deadlock, although Netanyahu's right-wing Likud party is leading in the polls. It will need coalition partners to secure a 61-seat majority in the 120-seat Knesset. That means Israel is looking at three possible outcomes. First, another coalition under Netanyahu. Secondly, an ideologically divided government united only by its opposition to Netanyahu. Or thirdly, a looming fifth election for the West Asian nation. However, Palestinians in the occupied West Bank shrugged off the vote. Most of them predict that it would produce yet another right-wing government.
Unfortunately, as Palestinian people, we will not count on the Israeli elections, since it revolves in a vicious circle. And for the past 30 years, there has not been any tangible progress on the ground.
All right, we are now being joined by Elon Levy, anchor and commentator. He's joining us from Tel Aviv. Polls suggest, or at least reports suggest, that Netanyahu's Likud party is still ahead, but maybe, just maybe, short of clear majority by a couple of seats. What's the latest that you're picking up?
That was actually a very good explanation over there. Yes, at the moment, as you explained, Israel has a coalition system of government. That means that whether the Likud gets more than 30 seats, fewer than 30 seats, it's still going to need to build a coalition. Now, Netanyahu is promising to form a fully right-wing government in alliance with the ultra-Orthodox and the religious nationalists. But the polls at the moment show it's really a toss-up whether they're going to get over 61 seats. And something extraordinary could happen. The joint Arab list split, with one faction saying it wants to be more involved in the national government, saying it wants to be able to trade support for specific policies. So there's also a scenario in which Netanyahu manages to get 61 together with the Islamist party. And that's something no one could have predicted last time. But at the moment, we're talking about four parties that are floating around the electoral threshold. In Israel, you need to win 3.25% of the vote in order to get into the Knesset. And there are four parties floating around that mark. That means that when the exit polls come out tonight, it will still be too early to tell. We're really going to have to count all of the votes in order to know which parties get in. Right. And that could well tilt the balance between the pro-Netanyahu bloc and the anti-Netanyahu bloc.
You're talking about four parties, right? Four main opposition parties. Now, these include leftist leaders and parties, centrists, as well as certain right-wingers who've broken away, or former allies from Netanyahu who have switched camps. So, if the opposition, a united opposition, does come to power, is there concern that whether this united opposition will be able to form a stable government, because the only unifying factor seems to be their opposition to Netanyahu?
There are many more than four parties. I was speaking about four parties that are floating around the electoral threshold. But absolutely, the fact that we have so many medium-sized parties, even Yesh Atid is struggling to cross the 20-seat mark out of a 120-seat parliament, makes it difficult for people to imagine anyone else as a prime minister. There is a scenario in which Yair Lapid, together with Likud defector Gidon Saar, religious nationalist Naftali Bennett, and a few other parties just managed to eke together 61. But right now, Naftali Bennett made it an election promise that he won't sit with Yair Lapid, who seems to be the head of the second biggest party. So even if the anti-Netanyahu bloc gets a majority, we have so many people promising not to sit with each other or pledging not to sit with each other, that something is going to have to give in order for them to climb down and form a government.
Absolutely, Elon, like, we have been mentioning, there doesn't seem to be a unifying factor among the opposition camp in Israel. But let's focus on Netanyahu. He's obviously facing corruption charges. There have been thousands and thousands of people who are out on the streets who have been protesting against Netanyahu, demanding that he resign for some time now. But at the same time, Netanyahu has been praised globally for the vaccination drive in Israel. He's called Israel the vaccination nation. He still enjoys a lot of support in the orthodox sections of society. So, leading up to the election, what was the wave? Was it a pro-Netanyahu wave or an anti-Netanyahu wave?
Look, the momentum is definitely with Netanyahu and the Likud party at the moment. The fact that Israel is leading the world in vaccines, really, to the Prime Minister's credit, and that's something that he's made a lot of use of in the election campaign, saying, look, we are now 60% of the population has been vaccinated at least once. When you consider that 30% of the country are children, it means basically everyone in Israel has been vaccinated at least once, far ahead of the rest of the world. In Israel now, cafes, bars, restaurants, they're full. We look at the rest of the world, we see them going into fresh lockdowns. So the Likud has definitely made that the centerpiece of their campaign. On the other side, the opposition, including defectors from the right-wing camp, say it's simply unconscionable for a prime minister who is currently on trial, not just facing charges, he is actively a criminal defendant now in a corruption case, to continue leading the country, to have control over who the Attorney General is, to promise reforms of the justice system. And so Yair Lapid and the Yesh Atid party have been pushing a message saying, let sanity win, let's restore some normalcy to the country. But I don't think anyone is challenging Netanyahu on the fact that we have the vaccines, the first in the world to more or less reach herd immunity, although they are still attacking him for the handling of the coronavirus pandemic itself. Let's not forget, 6,000 people in Israel died. We had waves that were much sharper, much more destructive than in many other places in the world. And so the question is, in these last few days, what people remember, whether they're riding on the high of the vaccines and whether they're giving Netanyahu personal credit for that, or whether they're thinking of the handling of the coronavirus, they're thinking about his corruption trials, the fact that he's now been prime minister for 15 years on and off, and think, thank you very much, but it's time for new leadership.
Elon, one final question to you. When can we expect the numbers to start rolling in? When can we expect the result? How real is the possibility of a fifth election in Israel? And if that does happen, will that be a worst-case scenario for Israelis?
You ask a lot of questions. I'll start at the beginning. 10 o'clock tonight, Israel time, we will have the exit polls from the three main channels. Those aren't results, those are exit polls. And then the counting begins immediately. Israel doesn't have constituencies. We're one big constituency, although a very small country, certainly compared to India. So normally by the morning, there's a good picture of what the results are. Let's remember, though, this time there are many votes that will have to be counted twice because of the way that the coronavirus special restrictions have taken place. So we might not know until the end of the week quite what the results are, certainly if it's close and there are parties below the electoral threshold. And yes, fifth elections are definitely a possibility. If Netanyahu plus Naftali Bennett reach 61 tonight, it's likely game over. Netanyahu will be prime minister. If they don't reach 61, it's possible that maybe Yair Lapid, maybe someone else can form a government. But definitely it's possible that with too many parties promising not to sit with each other, that even if it's possible, the opposition will really squander that opportunity and will go back to fifth elections. An immense amount of frustration in this country. We had the first election in April 2019. Netanyahu was unable to form a majority. Since then, we've been through, this is the fourth election. Definitely very disturbing for Israelis and a scenario no one wants to see happen. But let's say no one will be surprised if that's the case.
Elon Levy, thank you so much for joining us from Tel Aviv with the latest on Israel polls. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.